Good morning, everyone. Actually, I think it's just clicked over to afternoon. Hello and welcome to our Greenprints Exchange workshop. We're really pleased today to be able to talk to you about scenario planning. In a moment, I'll introduce our wonderful workshop host, Kiah Smith. But first, I'd like to introduce myself. So I am Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. I'm also the creator, but now the partner in crime with many others building the Greenprints program, which I will tell you a little bit about in a moment. First of all, though, to make sure you're all in the right session, today's session is an introduction to scenario planning, and we're very excited about it, actually. But I'd also like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play here in the beautiful lands of the Yagara Turrbal peoples in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and the remarkable civilizational culture that has cared for country and cared for kin since time immemorial. In the work that we do, we also like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation and the terrible injustices that continue today for the Indigenous peoples of this country. Our commitment inside AELA and Greenprints is to ensure that wherever possible, we work in solidarity with Indigenous friends and colleagues. And on that note, I'd encourage you all to connect with some of the work that AELA and Future Dreaming do together, including a very quick plug, beautiful workshop this Saturday, which I'll tell you more about later, with the wonderful Mary Graham, Kombu Mary woman, and one of Australia's leading philosophers and thinkers. So I'll tell you more about that workshop on Saturday. But as part of our acknowledgement of country, we do really like to recognise and situate ourselves within this place of settlers. But our love of country is what drives us on. And what I'd like to do is just quickly tell you a little bit about the Greenprints approach, if you don't know much about it. Before I do that, just might let Kiah wave and say g'day. Kiah, thanks so much for being our awesome presenter in our Greenprints Exchange today. Did you want to just introduce yourself and then I'll tell folks about Greenprints?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks, Michelle, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to come along today to talk to you and the Greenprints network. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional Turrbal and Yagara people, traditional owners on the country in which I work and live. And as you'll see in this presentation, I'm a food justice scholar here at the University of Queensland in the School of Social Science. So it's also very important when I'm doing my work to acknowledge the ongoing connection to country and the long-standing history of Indigenous work in the food system. You know, there's ongoing connections to land and sea management that we can continue to learn from today. So as I said, I'm a scholar in sociology at the School of Social Science, and today I'm also part and presenting here as part of two research clusters that we have in our school, the society and, hang on, we've got two, what are they? The Justice and Society and Inequality and Social Change clusters. So we're also doing that as part of that. So I've got some wonderful UQ folk in the room as well today that I'd like to say hi to. So that's all from me, and I'll introduce the work in a moment.
Yeah, thank you, Kiah. And I should have mentioned it's a sort of a hybrid event. We had more than 80 people register. So what we're finding these days is keen folk join us live and many other people watch the recording. So it's always important that the recordings are shared freely and publicly for the work that we do. So thank you so much. What I might do for a moment, Andy's just put in where he's from. Please do feel free. It's become a lovely Zoom tradition for folks to write in the chat who they are and whose country they're on and where you're from. And what I'll do in a minute, I'm just going to share screen and give you this brief introduction to the Greenprints approach. Many of you would probably know it pretty well, but this is our opportunity to invite you to become part of this network. So very quickly, our organisation, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, our sort of basic mission or our work, we try to help people understand and implement Earth-centred systems change with a particular focus on what we call loosely the governance structures of our society around law, economics, culture, arts, education, ethics, and much more. One element of our work, and our website is earthlaws.org.au. Please do visit us one day and have a look at all the cool projects and the lovely people that we work with. Greenprints really at its essence is a pulling together of all the cool things we've done for 10 years in terms of connecting with not just systems change, but Indigenous knowledge systems, and starting from country and caring for land and place as really the center point of transitioning our industrialized societies to something that's much more regenerative, compassionate, and patterning ourselves into the unique places and ecosystems on this gorgeous continent of ours. So Greenprints has become, it was the nickname because I was constantly thinking about how we have these blueprints for everything, but what we don't have are some nice simple pathways for people to build and bring together all of the remarkable initiatives that are out there so that we can all move in a similar direction. So Greenprints becomes a noun and a verb in the work that we do. You're a green printer if you're engaging in the Greenprints approach. And really it's two things. It's a process, and it's eventually for different communities who want to do so, it's also an output. So Greenprints offers an earth-centered way to help us find and use all of the best stuff that's already out there, sustainability, regenerative approaches across all Western disciplines, but starting from Indigenous knowledge and connection to place. So it's a process, and there are some steps, and I'm just going to quickly tell you about them, but not go into any detail. And the output is really that for whatever boundaries or place that people in whatever capacity they are part of, a council, a community, a school, whatever you're looking at, whatever part of the world you're going to start looking at how humans fit into place, the output is about different scenarios and choosing the healthiest path forward. And that's why today's session is so exciting, because what we're building through our Greenprints Exchange is a network of remarkable people working on cool topics, and we're sharing their information into the network through these webinars. And eventually on our website, for all of the steps and activities, there's going to be a clear way to find, well, what is scenario planning? How does that fit into the work we do? So that's how Kiah's workshop fits into some of the work that we're doing. But please, if you get a chance, have a little visit of the website if you're interested. There's so many different ways to connect into the community and the network, sharing your expertise, activating communities or joining existing communities that are bringing all the good stuff together. So when you look at the Greenprint steps, it's really about starting with caring for the earth first and then rethinking what human beings get up to. And under each one of these steps, which I won't have time to go into today, there's a lot of lovely work that's been done by lots and lots of cool people. And in a way, this developing scenarios for change is where we fit in today. Greenprints pretends to have these solid little stepping stones through the messiness and swampiness of sustainability and regenerative action, but in fact, it's a very messy process itself. I call these our little sanity steps, so we can stay sane as we work through the murk of all of this work we have to do and undo. So that's about all I wanted to do, was just really give you a plug for the Greenprints approach. But now, thankfully, I can just sit back and listen. So Kiah, I've got you on Spotlight and you can share screen. So we're all good. Over to you, Kiah. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Hi, everyone. All right. So thanks for that lovely introduction. And also, Michelle, for pointing out where scenarios fits in with the Greenprints approach. And so there's a really nice alignment. So today, what I'm going to try to do in a really short period of time. So I guess to say that scenarios, they take quite a lot of time and a lot of energy to build. And today I'm going to give you a really quick run through on what scenarios are and how we would actually do them. But there's lots more detail in there. So if you do want to find out more, feel free to contact me later, send me an email. I'm really happy to talk to people about scenarios if you want some more information. So as I mentioned, today's seminar I'm presenting in collaboration with the Society and Justice Cluster and the Inequality and Social Change Cluster here at UQ. Here we go. All right, we've done that. So today I want to do this presentation in two parts. In the first part, I want to talk a little bit about future scenarios and why we would want to imagine the future. So I'll talk a little bit about the background to scenarios thinking and futures thinking. And throughout the presentation today, I'm going to be drawing quite heavily on my own research in a project called Fair Food Futures. So I will introduce that project a little bit later. So lots of the examples come from that work, which is looking at fair food and food justice here in Australia and how that connects to the Global Sustainable Development Goals. In the second, and we'll have a little break. And then in the second part of the seminar, I'm going to talk you through a 3-step methodology for actually constructing a future scenario. And the way that I do scenarios are really participatory, using lots of different types of tools. So I'll present a few of those, but there are lots of different tools you can use to help you create scenarios in a participatory way. So I won't get time to talk about all of those. And then I'll talk a little bit about where, once you've got a scenario, what you might be able to do with that. Okay, before we start, and I'm just going to try to get on the side here. There we go, just so I can see who else might be in the room. First of all, I just want to get us thinking about the future. And this is a really nice little exercise. I'm going to invite you all to participate, even those of you online. The first question then I've got for you is to think about the future. If you close your eyes and imagine the future, say in 50 years time, in 100 years time, what are you afraid of? Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes. For those of you online, you can if you feel willing to share, type it in the chat what you're afraid of. For those of you in the room, I invite you, we've got a couple of whiteboards at the front here. Come and write it up here. Just a couple of points on the side here of fears. What are you afraid of? 50, 100 years time into the future. Let me get the chat. Where do I see the chat? Okay. Right. Maybe we'll just leave them up here, I reckon. But we can see them up here and then people in the room can see. Okay, so for those of you online, if you look in the chat, people are starting to put some things up here. Afraid of climate change, Earth system collapse, violence, greed, poverty, inequality. Yeah, having no water or food, war, conflict. Yeah, it's all pretty grim when we think about what we're afraid of. Air pollution, afraid for future generations. Yeah. People worrying about futures for children, too much technology. Yeah. And in the room, we've got people writing things like World War III, climate change. Yep, extreme inequality and social division, no clean air, no food. Extreme individualism, no privacy, totalitarianism. Okay. No wildlife, biodiversity collapse, lots of fears there in the chat. What else have we got? Capitalism going wild. Ecosystem failure. Yep. Lots of kind of common fears across people. Lots of those fears around ecology and the natural environment not supporting us. Conflict. Losing our wildlife. Too much surveillance. Yep. Digital barriers and policing. Yep. Okay. All right. Now, thank you. Mental health, more mental health problems growing. All right. So lots in the chat and lots on the board of these things that we're afraid of in the future. So the next thing then is I invite you to think about it, one or two of those that you imagined in the future that you're afraid of. What would you imagine to be its opposite? You want to flip that around. What's the opposite of that? What does it look like? Have a little think, and then on the board we've got a board over here for opposites, and in the chat as well. What would the opposite of that fearful future be? All right, so online, people, abundance thinking, not scarcity thinking, less consumption, equity, thriving humans and ecosystems. a return to a simpler way of living, total rejection of problematic behavior. What else? Intentional communities, preventative health rather than reactive health, nature and people being as one. What have we got on there? We've got resurgence of communitarianism written on our board in the room, easy breathing. Abundance of resources and abundance of choice. Yeah. What else have we got online? Stable environment, sustaining everything. Strong social welfare on the board. We've got retreat of government interference. So it's interesting here that online you can already start to see people's futures thinking about, they're about our connection with the environment, our connection with what the political system might look like. Where we all support each other to care for children. So this idea of care, yeah. All right. So when you think about those opposites, how does that make you feel? Happy to hear from someone online if you just want to pipe up. How does it feel? How does it make you feel when you think about the opposite? Okay, so someone in the room said that we've got a lot of work to do. Yeah. That maybe we're being unrealistic. Okay. Yeah, and someone else in the room has said it makes them feel hopeful. What about online? Anyone online? Some people here saying hopeful, invigorating. We know that there's potential, so let's do it. Nice one, Amy. Inspiring.
I wrote that it makes me feel happy to imagine a biodiverse world. Like it actually fills me with happiness to imagine that, even if I know how hard it is.
Hopeful, inspiring, makes you feel happy. Yeah. All right. So everyone, you can sit down. Thanks. That's just a look. So absolutely. So I think this really gets, for me, this really gets to the heart of future scenarios and why personally I would want to use future scenarios as a way of doing research or doing activism, but also for people who participate in scenarios type of research. What it does is it takes this hopeful starting point. Even though a big part of scenarios is unpacking the challenges and the problems of the past, ultimately what the purpose of scenarios is to actually get to somewhere hopeful and positive. So one of the main reasons that we would want to imagine the future starts with now, and that now is a present of deep uncertainty. And this is where, you see that these uncertainties surrounding social phenomena or long-term policies, where we don't know how that future is going to unfold. Decision makers don't know, or they can't agree on the appropriate models to describe the system of the future. And it's really difficult to quantify the likelihood of occurrence of different types of futures. So this idea of deep uncertainty makes planning for the future very challenging. And certainly in a context of sustainability, and I'm talking here about a deep sustainability as well, that really looks at social, ecological, and economic brought together. In the context of transitioning to a more sustainable future, this planning is always going to happen within a context of deep uncertainty. But there's another reason. And I think for me, this is a reason which is somewhat a bit more philosophical, maybe a bit more existential. But in order to build a better future, we must first be able to imagine ourselves there. Okay, we're never going to be able to create a future that we want unless we can use our imagination personally and collectively to imagine what those futures are. So future scenarios can provide a method to do that a bit more systematically. So I'd like to play a clip here for you to give you a bit of an idea of how, actually, it's here, how we might use futures. Okay, so there was a lovely example of future scenarios. In that little clip, we saw 4 different scenarios. We saw some scenarios that were really, that we probably don't want, that were really negative. I saw people's faces in the room looking quite sad. We saw some scenarios that looked really utopian, perhaps utopian in the way of the idea that it might be unreachable, utopian. And then we saw one in there that possibly might be a bit more likely. So this is one way, shows a certain approach to thinking about using scenarios. So what are they? Scenarios are narratives about the future, and they can help communities, governments, and other stakeholders better understand and prepare for changes and identify present actions to work towards a desired future. So scenarios use two kind of main tools, and that's foresight and backcasting. So foresight refers to a way to develop a range of views of possible paths describing how the future might develop or how we would like it to be developed. And then backcasting is where we work backwards to determine what decisions need to be made today in order to make the best possible tomorrow. So scenarios then identify that many different futures are possible. They might be positive futures, they might be negative futures, they might be plausible or non-plausible. And a key part of doing scenarios work is to identify or understand that different stakeholders are going to have different preferences about the types of futures they'd like to see. So scenarios aim to capture all of the uncertainties faced by the scenario topic and to highlight issues that might have a significant impact on the topic. They aim to study relationships between these issues and to broaden rather than narrow the vision of the planning team. I think I've got another slide there. There's another way to say it. So one hand, we want to understand relationships between the current issues and challenges and uncertainties. And here we talk about the drivers of change. The next aim then is to open up space for the debating the different types of futures that might then come from these challenges and to broaden the vision for planning. And then the third key aim is to engage participants who hold different views and to potentially aim towards building consensus and shared understanding, but this might not always be possible. And that actually within future scenarios, what I really like about the method is it keeps open space for dialogue and contestation. Personally, for me, I really like scenarios because they can open up space to debate who has the power to bring different futures into being. And I use a concept called food utopias that comes from food scholarship. And this says that by actually focusing on the types of futures that we do want to see and that we can already actually start to see in practice in everyday experimentation here today, we can recognize the problems, but use this as a tool to build hope and possibility in discussions about the future. So scenarios require quite a bit of knowledge and resources, particularly in addressing the first aim in the red circle here. And this is where you really need to draw on quite a lot of background understanding about the uncertainty and the challenges that are happening today. The other challenge around particularly here, the green circle, is around participation itself and contestation, but also it's really important to be able to have a good understanding of the kinds of stakeholders that should be part of this dialogue. And that's quite a strategic decision sometimes. Sometimes you might not want to have all of the stakeholders in a room who you know are very likely to have contesting ideas because it can make that dialogue very difficult. But in other cases, it might be really beneficial to have a broad range of stakeholders in the room and debating the scenarios. There are different types of scenarios. And the first one is called predictive. And this is kind of the first generation of scenario building. And these are usually a lot more they're not just statistical predictions of future conditions, but they do really depend on things like trend extrapolation and forecasting. So this first predictive stage used a lot more quantitative modeling techniques to predict what will happen. So for example, we see that in like a lot of the climate modeling. It's used as quantitative models to predict what is likely to happen. The second type of scenarios are called explorative scenarios. And this really wants to ask, well, what can happen in the future? And this is more a process that acknowledges discontinuities, novelty, irregular and radical change or disruptions that are likely to happen, which are quite difficult to model for in the first type of scenario. They try to understand what can or might happen irrespective of the current trends. So they take current trends into consideration, but then try to extrapolate from that a little bit more. Often you see this type of scenarios being developed to cover a wide range of possible futures. So in other words, explorative scenarios provide a set of alternative futures, which could be totally different from each other. The third type of scenarios are normative scenarios, and these are really scenarios that aim to answer the question of what should happen in the future. And this is related to the rise in more like normative concepts such as sustainability, where a third generation of scenarios was developed to allow decision makers to describe a desirable future and think about how we would achieve it. So not just any futures, but what normatively is the most desirable when it comes to sustainability, perhaps around equity, and in my work in food justice. And in addressing this question of what should happen, these types of scenarios can create conditions for more proactive and emancipatory action. And you're going to see still here that different transition pathways will emerge. So it's possibly less about different contrasting or contradictory scenarios and more about the different transition pathways you could take to get there. All right, so here's an illustration that shows a little bit about how these types of futures might come into being. So when we make scenarios, we start off first about thinking about the past in terms of what got us here to the present situation. And then futures can go in three different ways. They can go into what is going to happen, that expected future, what might happen instead, so a series of alternative futures, or what do you want to happen? And they would be your preferred futures. And everyone who's wanting to implement a scenario method might have different reasons for choosing the type of approach that they want to take. In my work, like I said before, I use the concept of food utopias, and all of my work in food justice is really focused on the preferred future that we want. There's a lot of work in food systems work looking at the types of futures that we might have from particular perspectives, and a lot of those are coming from food industry or industrial agriculture. So in my work in food justice with grassroots civic food actors, I'm really focused on the types of creative, imaginative futures that civil society in particular want to see, and they're quite different. All right, I'm not going to play these because I'm concerned that we might run out of time. Although, how are we going? It's about 22. Actually, I'll play this one, this short one for you. This is one example of some scenarios that have been created around the workforce of the future. So I'll play you this and you tell me what you think. Okay. So the reason why I wanted to show you that short clip is because this is a good example of scenarios being used, particularly for businesses and talking to corporations or the private sector. This is where we see scenarios having been used quite a bit in the past or currently in terms of thinking about what are the challenges that are going to affect a particular industry, and then what does this mean for planning in a business sense. But they are used, and this is used much more often and more commonly than what we've seen scenario building being used in civil society space. But there are a few good examples of this. Oh, before I get actually, I'll show you this one next. Here's an example of really recent scenario planning that's been done in the food space by civil society organisation. And what they did is presented two scenarios. So not four, but two scenarios. One which was about agribusiness as usual, so it was kind of what's very likely to happen if we don't make any changes and we stay there today. And the other one on the other side is thinking about looking ahead with civil society being much more central in shaping food system work in the future. So here's an example where they've just presented two different scenarios, quite contrasting. I think people in the chat are, nope, that's all right. Okay, now the next one I wanted to quickly show you is this one here. This one comes from the CSIRO. So scenarios are also used by science and research organisations. This one was developed by the Digiscape Future Science platform. And what they've done is presented 4 different scenarios. And you'll see this matrix pop up quite a lot in the rest of the presentation today, because this is how you construct a scenario. But what CSIRO did is they used 2 main axes of key drivers or trends. One of those was shifting farm business models. So from on the one end of a continuum, very innovative farm models, on the other end, more conservative business models. And then you've got the axis that goes up and down axis, and you've got resource insecurity or uncertainty, which is very significant or it's quite limited. And so this is the approach, and you'll see this play out a little bit more as I talk. So what CSIRO has done is use that axis to then present the 4 different scenarios that might happen when those changes or drivers collide with each other. So that's another approach that you can use to scenario building. All right, here's another approach that you can use, and this comes from my research. This is an approach where, as I said before, I've used a food utopias concept to say, well, what are the few futures that we want to see? And while we use the method of using the 2 axes, and which again, I'll show you in a moment, we did this in lots of different workshops with many different groups. So in every single workshop, we came up with lots of different scenarios. What this project has done is zoomed in on the ones that people wanted to see the most utopian, the most kind of radically shifting, radically kind of structurally different food utopias that we might like to see. So this is another example. I'm not presenting in this work the food futures that people didn't want to see, or the ones that we might very likely see. We wanted to really push towards, well, what can we see if we think more radically about food system transformation? All right. So another really good reason to use scenarios planning, and I think particularly why they're great for the community development space or environmental movements or civic activism, but I think also in education, in our university system, thinking about working with students or working with people in this setting, is that they can be really powerful tools for one, stimulating learning that's outside of a technical expertise, so an industry or business kind of mind. But they open up space for power and participation and even resistance to happen. And we call this, space to think the unthinkable. So participation of groups with diverse knowledges, values, and expertise is really fundamental to do scenario development, because the strengths at scenarios, this comes from incorporating a breadth of ideas about the future. So scenarios can open up mind to new unimaginable possibilities and challenge long-held beliefs. They can compel participants to really radically rethink the hypotheses on which they've founded your actions, those assumptions. They can be really, they can respect differences and encourage multiple perspectives, because in scenario building, we hold multiple futures alongside each other. They can combine quantitative and qualitative knowledge. Different forms of data can be used to inform the scenario building. They can reframe questions across disciplines. So I think that's a really useful way to thinking outside, your box and outside of the, the silos that we sometimes think in. They can support organizational learning and improve decision-making. So that can happen both within the process of doing scenario building, but also in the types of actions that you might want to see come out of a scenario. They can help create a common language for dealing with quite strategic issues, and particularly across different disciplines or different social groups. You can have it by having a common language, you can start to move towards common action. But I think what I like the most of the last 2 points is that they project the future as full of possibility, hopeful, they're imaginative, they're creative, and they're really fun. And they're based on a much more collaborative conversation. And this is a conversation that can become more inclusive and potentially more emancipatory. So as I said, I'm going to be drawing quite a few examples from my work on Fair Food Futures. I'm not going to go into this too much. You can have a look online at fairfoodfutures.com if you want to find out more. But it's a part of a local initiative where I've been working with lots of grassroots fair food actors across Australia, part national research study, therefore, that aims to co-create future scenarios. And really central to this co-creation has been to think about participation in the food system of civil society and the concept of food justice. So we've brought both of those really centrally into thinking about what will the future of food look like. And the main question that we've asked in this study is, what is our preferred food future and how do we get there? Quite a simple question, but it's opened up lots of really imaginative possibilities for the future of food. So we started with this. Here's just some examples. One of the first questions we asked when I did these workshops and when we started the study was to ask people, well, what does fair food mean to you? And I think no matter what your topic is that you want to focus on in scenarios, this is a nice way to just open the conversation. It also starts to highlight different ways that people use language, different words and terminology that are associated with the issue that you're interested in. And it can start bringing up problems as well. So when you're talking about fair food, for example, it starts to raise issues about local food, distributive justice, sustainability, rights, and all of these things will be touched upon as the project continues, as the workshops, as all the different tools come together later on. So this is a really nice tool that I think you should use at the beginning to start the conversation. The next thing that I did in my research is, because scenarios, the end result is a storyline or a narrative about the type of future, we use these 4 questions throughout the process to keep zooming back and keep focusing on that overall question. So we ask people to think about what is food, how is it produced and by whom, what does food consumption look like, and how is food justice achieved? Now, obviously, if you're not doing a study on food futures, something else, you would change these questions. But this emerged out of a bit of trial and error, actually, didn't it, Camille? We didn't do this in our first workshops. It was only until about workshop 3 that we thought, oh, you know what, we need a framework to bring this together to keep all our very diverse participants really tightly focused on food. Because, you know, we started talking about all kinds of things that were relevant, but difficult to bring into the scope of the project. So I really suggest, you know, zooming in and having some guiding questions that you can keep returning to every now and then. And as you'll see later, these 4 questions were then used to actually frame the final narratives when they're written. All right. So this is just an example from my study. And after this, we're going to have a short break, I think, just 5 minutes. And then I'm going to talk you through the different steps. But on this slide, you can see over on the left, you can see some of the tools we use in a participatory workshop where we had people writing all their ideas using sticky notes and using pens and paper. And then in the middle here, you see a scenario that we constructed for Moreton Bay. Now, in Moreton Bay, again, here's 4 scenarios that were all utopian scenarios, all the ones they wanted to see. But what I wanted to point out here is how important for us it's been to use visual and illustration tools in constructing these scenarios. So we actually chose to present the scenarios in a narrative form, but also using pictures. And as I later found out, and for those of you who are researchers like me, perhaps, I was really amazed and surprised at how central the visual imagery became in actually doing the data analysis. So I actually use a lot of these images to almost like thematic analysis and coding of qualitative data. I actually use the images in much the same way and ended up, you know, I chopped them up and I moved them around. I put them in groups, just like you might do with quantitative textual data that you might organize in a qualitative software like Envivo or when you do coding. All right, so over on the right then is one of the completed scenarios. And again, we used illustration. I worked with Brenna Quinlan to do beautiful illustrations of each of our scenarios. And then we have some of the textual narrative there that you can see. Now, each of these come with their own big full storyline. And within that, there's lots of theory about food justice, but there's also lots of practical action. And so for me in this project, it's I found it really useful to take quite a complex process of scenario building and then find ways to simplify the communication of that so that a more diverse audience can actually take something away. And hopefully for the civic fair food actors I've worked with, they can use these scenarios in their own advocacy, in their own discussions with each other, however they like. All right, so there are 3 steps to creating a scenario. And the first one is forecasting. And this is where we, I'll just find my notes. Where am I up to? Here somewhere. Yeah. So forecasting is where we define the focus and the purpose of the scenario, where we establish the boundaries and where we think about what are the drivers of change. And the drivers of change are a really important part of scenarios because this is what forms the structure for thinking about 4 quadrants of a scenario, which I will show you in a minute. The second step is the visioning, and this is the fun part. Oh, sorry, before I go to the second step, the first step is actually where a lot of information comes in. This actually is quite an intense step in scenarios. It's not the exciting step because you don't have the scenario yet to work with, but this is all the groundwork that you need to be able to really think through, whether it be environmental conditions, social, political factors that are driving change. And it does take quite a lot of background knowledge of participants. who are helping to construct that scenario. But this is where you can draw on other types of information. So in my study, for example, we looked at policy documents, we read lots of literature about different drivers of change in the food system. We talked to lots of different participants as well. So it doesn't have to be academic knowledge that informs this or scientific, it can be lived experiences, but you pull together lots of different forms of information to set the context for your scenario. Okay, the second step is visioning, and this is the really fun part. Oh, I've got lots of things in the chat here. Is this, just double check it now to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. Visioning's a fun bit. This is where we build the scenario, and I'm going to introduce a couple of tools that we've used to help do that, and that's called Seeds of Change and Future Wheels. And then the third part is also a really important part of scenarios, because they're not just a tool for understanding or connecting, they're also a tool for thinking about pathways and action. So in that last part, I've put refining the scenarios under that action part, because this is a really participatory process as well, where you get to go back to the storylines that were created, and you actually get to start to think about, all right, well, how would we get there? What would we need to do? And then then that becomes a little bit integrated into the scenario and can get used to refine it. Here we would choose a preferred future, if that's what you want to do, but that's a fun bit. And then we ask about how we get there, and we think about action. Okay, so here's another kind of visual representation of the different steps to show you what you might do. So over here on the left, you see you would scope the scenario field. So that's where you look at the boundaries, you look about what we might, what are the different drivers here that are around your issue. You identify the key factors within that, you analyze those. And then in step 4 over here, you've got the actual scenario generation. And then in step 5, it's this kind of idea of paths to action. Over on the right, you see another way. And what I liked about this is it brought in the step of that desk work. Where do you get the starting point from? Is it interviews? Is it literature? Is it discussions? And then also the illustration on the right was also really good, because it shows here that in this project, they use 2 different workshops to create a scenario. So that's another thing for those of you wanting to do this practically. I'd suggest that you need at least 2 workshops to create a scenario. And in our study, I'll talk about it maybe a little bit later, but we use workshop 1 to construct. And then we had a break in the middle where the research team came back. We did a whole lot of analysis. We had Brenna create those beautiful illustrations. And then we took that back to participants on day 2 in the second workshop to refine and to rethink what we want the final scenarios to look like. Okay. So let's have a little break. I know that's a bit dense. What time is it? It's about 1. Let's come back in about 5 minutes and we'll continue. And I'm going to talk to you more about some of those practical things that we can do.
Thank you so much, Kiah.
Okay.
A couple of folks had questions about the recordings. Yes, we're very lucky. Kiah's letting us record all of this. And can I just remind folks that while this workshop is talking about the method, what we're very keen to be doing in the Greenprints project, which also connects to Regen Brisbane, and a number of community projects in Southeast Queensland, is actually turning these scenario processes into something real. And whether Kiah knows it yet or not, we'll be inviting her in and trying to find some sort of resourcing to get her to help us do some of these processes. So we can't wait to make them practical. And whether you're connected to Regen Brisbane or Greenprints or not, everybody's very welcome to always connect with the work that AELA does. Thank you. So have a break. I'll stop talking. Thank you so much, Kiah. It's been brilliant so far.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Okay. Hopefully you're all back. We're going to get going and keep moving. I see an interesting question in the chat here, which is also something we've been discussing here in the room, about this idea, I guess, that, in using future scenarios, can it become something that's kind of so utopian that it's unrealistic and therefore not really all that helpful, perhaps? So hopefully, I'm not going to answer that, because I think that's actually a really good discussion for people to think about and to reflect on. But in the next half of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the steps that we would take in scenarios. And I think that actually some of the activities that we do in the steps in constructing a scenario does touch on that question a little bit about what are the real physical constraints and what are the maybe, and not just physically in terms of environments, but physically in terms of those tangible political or social or cultural barriers or boundaries around what we might actually be able to achieve. And there are ways and scenarios that you can sort of build in acknowledge some of that in the scenario process. All right, is everyone still with me? Okay, all right, let's keep going. Okay, so as I said, there's a three steps to constructing scenarios, which I'm going to talk us through a little bit. The first step is to is forecasting. And this is where we're going to establish the focus, the purpose, and the boundaries around the scenario that you want to make. So this involves asking questions about what is your topic of focus, and that could be, it could really be anything. Obviously, in my work, the topic of focus was looking at alternative or fair food. It was about civil society participation in particular in that space. And the focus was around food justice, trying to bring a justice lens very explicitly into the scenario. And part of then doing this, and this is methodological, but also in thinking the types of futures you might actually create, is who should be included in the conversation. And that's really important. And certainly in my research, as we found out, some groups were present and some groups were less present. And this absolutely impacted on the kinds of conversations that would be had in the workshops that we did, but also in the type of outcomes and the types of things that influence the scenarios at the end. And as I mentioned before, thinking closely really about who those stakeholders are and who you want in the room matters, because, you know, conflicts can arise, differences, and if your aim is to have consensus versus keep that contestation, you've got to think closely about who participates. What is our time frame? Now, this would seem a really obvious question for a scenario, but it's actually not that easy to answer. So a short time frame, 3 to 5 years, it's not really long enough, particularly not if you're wanting to have kind of this big imaginative utopian type approach. And when I say, I guess I had to remind utopian, I'm not using the term utopian as terms of an airy fairy imaginative world that will never happen. I use utopia to actually refer to those real existing experiments that are examples of what might build in the future. But the time frame is really important. So you don't want to have a time frame that's too short, because if it's 2 to 3 years, coming back to that question of what are the boundaries and what's realistic, 3 years isn't a very long time for some of those big transformative changes to actually happen. So you want to make a longer time frame than that. However, if you push your time frame out too far, again, it's going to widen your scope of possibility to almost sometimes be a bit unmanageable. So in this work, it started off because the work on food futures was connected to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of the 2030 agenda. We started saying, well, let's think about to 2030. Now, we were doing this work in 2021. It's even to 2030, it's not that long of a time frame. So we talked about 2030, but we also had a bit of a loose time frame to 2050, because we realized that a lot of these transformations to deep sustainability are actually in real life going to take a lot longer than the next 9 years. So you have to think really about that time frame. The next question that's really important is what is outside of the scope of the process to address. So what's outside of our control? And this is really important as well. And in my project, what we decided to do is, rather than saying they're outside of the scope and we're not going to think about them, we actually took some things to just be taken for granted, that this is the context against which, no matter what scenarios we come up with, it's always going to have this as a background. So climate change for us was a really good example of this, that we decided we weren't going to put climate change into our axes for thinking about our food futures, because we were going to acknowledge that climate change is happening. Climate change is going to have real impacts on agriculture, on food security, on equity, and on justice. But then there were some other issues. So for example, in our study, we really took the process of urbanization, that this was actually something that we said, we're going to take this as a guarantee, as something that we're pretty sure this is going to continue, people moving to urban areas, and that urban spaces are going to be still in the future, in 100 years, really important for food. And there were some other things, population, another issue that was raised, is this outside of the scope? The last point here is then to think about, are there actually any plans by stakeholders that might influence the timeframe and the drivers that we've identified? So for example, if we were thinking about Brisbane, we might look to the Brisbane city plans, we might look to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a plan to 2030. What kind of governance or policies might be actually going to shape that in a very real and tangible way? And I think that comes back to the question that was raised in the chat a little bit. What are the actual real boundaries around that? Okay. So, and we're probably not going to get time to actually do the activities, but I want to talk to you a few of them. Here's an activity we used, and if you remember the little cone diagram that I'd put up earlier, scenarios always have to start from somewhere, and they start from where we are in the present, but we didn't get to the present from nowhere. We got to the present because of where we've come from in the past. So the first step, and something that we like to do at the start of a workshop, is to start thinking about, we did this by creating a timeline. And it's really easy to do. You just have a big long horizontal line on a page. People can come and put up their post-it notes, but thinking about what have been the key events or key elements that have happened from the past, and you can go as far back as you think is relevant up until now, that's gotten us where we are. And this starts to get us into one, thinking about those real constraints, thinking it helps to clarify what some of the boundaries around your scenario might be, because that's tricky to do. You might not know the boundary until you start having the discussions. So this was a really nice activity that you can do to help clarify the boundaries of your project. All right, the next thing, and this is super important, are drivers of change. And as you'll see in a minute, drivers of change are really important because they become the two axes on which you will actually design a scenario. So I wanted to do very quickly, just to put ourselves in that future thinking again, a bit of a chat about some drivers of change. Now, some of you are here in Brisbane, but not everyone. But as you might know, Brisbane is going to host the 2032 Olympic Games. What I thought we might do is, as a group, can we think about some of the factors that are likely to impact on social justice outcomes associated with the Olympics? So just either if you're online, you can pop it in the chat. I mean, oops, we don't want to like that, do we? Oh, hang on. I don't know why it's going big. Pop your ideas up in the chat. Here in the room, maybe have a little chat amongst yourselves for a couple of minutes. What are some of the drivers of change? Some of the things that you think are going to influence social justice? An important thing to keep in mind when I say drivers of change, we're not right now trying to predict the future, a positive outcome. You're not trying to worry just now about what the outcome of that driver will be. And what we actually tend to do is we frame these drivers of change as a continuum, as kind of, you know, it's either way. We could have a lot of something or not much of it. It could be intense, it could be not, it could have a, so we imagine them as a continuum. So I'll show you that in a minute. Now, let me just see if I can see the chat. Oh, it's going to do this. All right, so Andy's written up here, unnecessary, unsustainable construction, gentrification, housing and rents. An issue about housing and rents would be a driver. Yep, issue around homelessness, probably connecting with housing and rents there. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. This is why I chose this example, because I knew you were working on some work around Olympics. So social access. So, okay, so you've seen here, there's a few points that you've put up. It is. So this is interesting because we found the same. You sort of tend to imagine as what's going to happen. But I guess maybe what we would do is we might work with the ideas a bit and turn them into a more of a continuum. So for example, about housing and rents, you might actually go, okay, so housing and rent is going to really increase and become unaffordable. The other end of the continuum might be that housing and rents prices are kept stable. Let's say you can turn those issues that we're pointing to here into a continuum. All right. Anyone, what about in the room? Is there anything else there that you can think of that you might like to add? Infrastructure.
One of me is trying to lift the driver to zero Olympics, which means accommodating and transporting the visitors.
Yeah.
And the athletes at the games. That's the core, right?
Yeah. So the point here in the room was that the Olympics themselves have to actually be delivered. So you've got to transport the people, the accommodation, the transport around it, and actually delivering it. Yep.
Providing security is another one.
And
before, I was thinking less about the Olympics and more about some of the other big events.
Yeah.
and how much security has gone in that shapes not only people but the entire place.
Yeah. Yeah. So another point in the room was about security and how, and thinking about past events in Brisbane that have been like the G20 or like other big events like that, you know, where security has been really important. So you might take these ideas and then we turn them into a continuum. So I'll give you an example of that from, hopefully I've still got it here. Yes, I do. From the food work that we did. Now we did this quite collaboratively. We did one whole workshop actually where we presented the project, we presented the aims, and we had workshop participants actually brainstorm the drivers. Then what we did is that we then, as the researchers or the people on the other side, we took those drivers away and we worked with them and we worked out, okay, how do we reformulate these into a continuum? And then what we did is we had everybody rank them. And which is what I was going to try and do today if I could get the poll to work, but it won't. So that's okay. So here's a snapshot of what we did. We had lots of different drivers of food system change. So we had localizing food networks, local versus long supply chains. So something changing length. There was a driver there around food waste and its economic model. There was a driver around food governance and policy. Is it more participatory or less participatory? Sustainable agricultural production. Is this something that was going to increase or decrease? Disasters and pandemics. So there were lots of things here, and then participants ranked those. And then we used those to construct the scenarios. And because we did actually in this study project, we had over 100 participants from across the country, we were actually able to use all of these drivers in different combinations in different workshops. But you might not decide to do that in your own study. You might just choose the top 2 that you want to work with, for example. All right, so then this is what you do. The next step, and this is where you get to the fun bit, the visioning, is this is where you build the scenarios along those 2 axes. So here's an example of where we've taken 2 drivers. One of those drivers was this question of the length of the supply chain. You know, is this driver of change going to be that food networks are shifting towards more local, or are they actually becoming longer? That was one driver, and that's the one here you see horizontally. And you can kind of see how it's a continuum. At one end, they were longer, other end, they're shorter. And then in the middle axis here, oh, I've got lots of people in the chat, sorry. Okay. So then the central axis here is around disasters and pandemics in this example. So this was one that we use, and here we acknowledge that disasters were going to probably always happen, but remember we had a background of climate crisis or climate change as well. So participants acknowledge that, yes, disasters are here, but are we going to be able to respond? Is it kind of stabilized in the sense that our responses to that, or is it actually creating a lot more turbulence? So then what you can see in the little paragraphs that we've put in each axis, a bit of a description. So in the top right axis, this is going to be a scenario where you're based on greater frequency and intensity of crises, but high localization of food systems. Bottom right-hand corner, you've got a stable food system, stable in terms of the crisis that it's experiencing with high levels of localization. Bottom left-hand quadrant, you've got a stable food system, not too much crisis, but you've got your food system dominated by the long supply chains. And in the top corner here, you've got greater frequency and intensity of food crises, and you've got your food system dominated by long supply chains. So then this becomes the basis for thinking about your scenario and imagining and envisaging. And what we get people to do is then take lots of little post-it notes and start to imagine what happens in each quadrant. Start to place yourself in there and start to think through, well, if this is the context of my food system in this case, what could that look like? And we can build on this with some further tools. Where are we? All right. So this is the first tool that we like to use in thinking through those quadrants and what you might write on your little post-it notes to fill in the quadrants. And we ask people to think about social, technological, economic, environmental, political, and the values, the norms that you might see in each of these scenarios. And this is a way to get people to think a bit deeply about what it is. And then they do become quite tangible and quite detailed around what you might see in each quadrant. So this is the Steep V approach, and we would do this with lots of discussion, lots of post-it notes, and putting them all up on the wall. Here's an example of what that looked like in one of the workshops. And if you're in the room, we've got some lovely examples on the wall up on the far left. So that's kind of the first step of creating it. And in this example here, you can see that we had an axis around Indigenous knowledge and land rights, and we had that along the economic model that was around growth. People were starting to rethink that growth model there. The next thing then that we did is we went into just one of those quadrants. We asked people to think about, well, which one do you want to choose? Which quadrant do you like the most? And let's zoom in. And we used a tool called Future Wheels and Seeds of Change. So I really like this activity. I think this was probably my favorite one, because Seeds of Change, these are real world examples of ideas and practices that are currently marginal, but have potential to become transformative. They're a structured approach to envisage how seeds that we already have here today could become mainstream. And so we might, in thinking about seeds, we ask questions such as, all right, well, what innovations might come from this seed that we already see today? What needs to happen for this seed to grow in society today? What shifts might we need? And also today, what might need to disappear so that this seed can grow? And again, you can consider that steep V, social, technological, environmental, economic, political, and values, and thinking through those things. And then we build our seeds going out. Our primary influence, what would that then influence, and what will it influence at the tertiary level? And I think here is another opportunity to come back to that question that was raised before about how realistic are these scenarios? Because by starting with seeds of change that are real, this bases our kind of future predictions in something that's actually tangible today, and that has, we're pushed to think about something that we already know is existing and how do we grow that, rather than perhaps thinking the other way around, what's kind of a very far off ideal that we would have to work backwards from. So this is where we try to base it in tangible, and it becomes based in evidence and lived evidence. So in our study, which people talked about seeds such as food hubs, circular economy, loop models, lots of other exciting seeds that were kind of on the fringes of the food system, but that have the potential to grow if we can think about what might need to change to get us there. So here's an example of what that activity looks like. So in this example, people's seed was looking at more urban food production. So they were talking about, growing food on rooftops and in backyards or on verge gardens or in parks. And from there, building out. And you can see, ideas about employment and about cultural connection with community, education, lots of different elements then can grow from that seed. All right, there's lots of other tools that you can use. And this was also, I really loved this activity we did in Moreton Bay. This is where we actually asked participants to get creative and actually put down on a page what they thought their future vision might look like. And we had a whole bunch of cutouts from magazines, we had pens, and people got really creative. And this was we then took these away as the research team, we took them away, and this informed then how we put together the final scenarios. So it was really co-created. I used, there was a beautiful image in one of them, of a tree, and it had all these awesome things falling off it. And, we use this as inspiration for some of the stuff that was in the illustrations later on. All right. Then we move to the next step is about refining our scenarios. So here on the left, you see with the purple crosses, you can see one axes and the scenarios that we were building, two different axes around sustainable agriculture, and the other one was about land use and development. So thinking about urbanization in particular, encroaching on peri-urban space, things like that. And the cost of land came in there. And what happened with this, when all the post-it notes and all the discussions were happening, people chose up in the top right corner that this was their most preferred scenario. They liked the one where sustainable agriculture was mainstreamed and there was strong urban food production. They liked that scenario. So then what we did is we went away and we consolidated and analysed all of those different ideas that were coming out from the steep V analysis, and then put this into visual form. And this was a really great way to then be able to take our scenarios back to participants to refine the scenario. We had a whole bunch of these pictures, and if you're in the room, that's what I've got here on the right. These are not the final scenarios. This is this step here where we actually said, here is the narrative, and here's a visual representation of what your scenario looks like. We then let participants in different workshops come and tell us what they thought about that. Was something missing? You know, should there be something else included? And we use some questions to help do that. So to revise that, we asked, well, does this reflect the storyline that you were building about the desired future? Does it actually accurately reflect that? Are there any elements that we think should strengthen or reduce in focus? And in this, I've put the 4 X's, but for us, it was is food justice front and center. But obviously for you, it might be whatever your focus might be. Is that front and center? How could you improve that? You know, can you pull that forward a little bit more? And does your story illustrate interconnections between social, environmental, and economic factors, which for kind of thinking about deep sustainability, that's a really important question to keep coming back to. And then finally is, can you give your scenario a name? That's quite fun. Not always easy though, as we saw in our workshop. So up on the wall, we've got quite a few different scenarios that emerged from our research. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly look on the chat. I can see so much here. Okay. All right. All right, so then the next step is this really moving us towards action. And this is where we say, all right, well, here's our future scenario. Here are all the components of it that we've thought through and that we would like to see. What do we need to do to get there? And it's interesting because when I was putting the presentation together, I thought I've got one slide on this, but I think this is the hardest part of the scenario building. How do we actually get there? And it does, in having this discussion, you'll find we found that we returned quite a lot to the assumptions that were made, to the types of participants that were in the room, to the understanding of policy settings and other dynamics outside of the scenario itself that are going to impact on that. So it actually becomes quite complex. I've put the little QR code on here for you. This should take you to a Padlet where the early scenarios that we did coming out of Brisbane are up on there. So what we did here is we used the Padlet. Participants in the workshop and online participants in particular could go in there. You could see the draft scenarios and you could type in your ideas. You could type in ideas about how you think we could get there. So I want to put this up here now because I'm not going to show you the 4 draft scenarios that we created in my project, but you can look at them if you want to. Yeah.
Is that a child paying for the next quarter?
It's possibly, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And this, I guess, was created a couple of years ago, right? Start of COVID. Yeah. Yeah. It's another one of Brenna's illustrations. The question was it a child in a cage on the Mexican border? And I think that's definitely what it was reflecting. So in this question, what do we need to do to get there? We would ask some key questions. And first of those is, well, what elements of the current system need to decrease in order for us to get to our preferred future? And then the converse of that, what elements in our preferred future what elements now need to grow to get us to our preferred future? And then we would ask what specific policies or stakeholders should be targeted in order to grow or decrease those particular points. And how might we overcome barriers? Because in this discussion, inevitably, a lot of barriers get discussed, sometimes more than the actual ways to get there. But that's all part of the imaginary and the design. So here I want to show you, this is one of the final scenarios that was created in the Fair Food Project. And this one was called Fair Food in the City. So this was the one that was made from the purple matrix that you saw up on the screen earlier on. And here it was responding to 2 drivers of food system change. One was the shift towards more sustainable agricultural production, and then alongside this pressure for land use for urban development. So we ended up with a scenario that was quite urban focused, but in discussing this scenario, a lot of discussion was also around how cities connected with rural places and vice versa. Lots of questions were raised around, well, doing urban food production in the city might be one thing, but what does that say about regional, rural towns, places, and the connection between the two? So we had lots of really good, rich discussions of that. And in this scenario, this reimagines cities as places for strengthening resilience, where healthy food is grown on the streets, in parks, apartment blocks, backyards, and community gardens. Town planning is committed to rethinking land access and repurposing urban spaces to grow more food, and regulatory barriers have been reduced. So here's a narrative that's quite broad, but from that, it prompts us to ask questions on, all right, what are the very practical actions then that might get towards this? What are the specific regulatory barriers that might need to change? And I think a really important thing to keep in mind, it's not just about what the actions will be, but who will be doing those, who would be doing those actions and participating in that, and who might be excluded. So one of the questions that was asked to me earlier was, you know, what kind of research questions that can these scenarios answer? And as a researcher, what I find now we've created these scenarios is it raises more questions and challenges us to think about, all right, well, let's look into these scenarios and what civil society is proposing, and actually start to ask, well, could that happen and how? If this did happen, who might be included and excluded? Who might benefit, who might lose? You know, for example, the right to food is a really good example. It was raised time and time again, and it's actually formed a key pathways, which we call food and rights for all. But in presenting that as a pathway to action, it also opens up space for us to actually think about, well, what does that mean? What does that rights for all, what would it look like? And how might it actually contradict with some other ways of thinking about participation? For example, ideas around Indigenous sovereignty that aren't necessarily aligned with the concept of the right to food. Okay. So we're nearly there, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me. So the last step is again, how do we get there? And this is somewhat stepping outside of the scenario itself and thinking about, well, what kind of outputs, impacts, communication tools would be useful, or do we want to try to use to so that this process has an impact beyond creating a scenario itself? So questions about, well, how might you take what we've done in a scenario building workshop back to your organization? How might you communicate what you've learned, or the discussions or dialogues that have been had? What kinds of tools or formats might be most useful for presenting the findings? Who is your target audience? Who are you trying to influence by creating a scenario? And I think, and when I say that, I really mean the process of making the scenario, as well as then the scenario output itself as a communication tool. What connections, networks or supports might be needed? And I think for me, this question relates to the actual outcome of the scenario and using it to influence. Say, if you want to use it to influence policymakers, well, what kind of networks might be necessary to think about there? But it also, I think, can come down to, well, what kind of networks might we need to strengthen in terms of who actually came together through this process? So in the fair food work, as I said, over 100 different fair food actors have come together in this dialogue. You know, what kind of networks nationally or regionally or in Brisbane and tools might we need to continue this discussion and to continue to build the strength of ideas sharing and dialogue that we've just experimented with through this type of methodology? And then finally, what are some of the key messages for governments or for civil society, or indeed whoever it is that you might be seeking to inform or influence or engage? And they don't have easy answers. For our project, I'm really excited to say that coming up later in this year, we will be creating an animation from the work, and we're going to be creating, we're doing a podcast series as well, based on the 4 transformative pathways that have come out of this work. And that's really exciting in terms of how we reconnect back to fair food actors, but also how do we translate that message into different formats. All right. So thank you. That actually brings me to the end of my talk today. My name's Kiah. You can contact me at ke.smith2@uq.edu.au. If you see on the right, the little, if you wanted to go to that QR code, this will take you directly to the project website. And on here, you will find a policy brief that we've just put up at the beginning of July. 1st of July, we launched the research findings. And this is where you can actually see the 4 scenarios, the narratives, and the discussion of how that connects with governance. So the project, the website, still lots of things happening still. The next step of my research on food futures is to connect this more strongly with sustainable development goals, and thinking about these future visions as visions that might differ from what the SDGs are seeing. But I think there's lots of ways that you can, that you can use future scenarios. So I think that's me. I'll escape that now, stop sharing my screen, and Yeah, look, thanks everyone. That brings me to the end. I'd like to open it up if anyone has any questions. Please feel free. We've got a few more minutes still. Ask questions and great. Oh, thank you. Thanks everyone. Thank you for coming along. I hope that you can find some of those tools useful.
Yeah, thank you, Kiah. And I'm sure if you have a look in the comments, everyone's saying wonderful presentation, absolutely amazing. Love all the visuals, love the graphics. Thank you for your time. We do have at least 10 minutes if people want to ask questions and if Kiah isn't utterly exhausted. And I'll let Kiah and her colleagues handle that in the room.
Yeah.
There's a lot of technical questions that we perhaps don't have a lot of time to explore today because today was called an introduction to scenario planning. But one question that I noticed someone asked was about, and we've already touched on it, but the wishful thinking side of it. Did you want to come back to that a little bit, Kiah? How do we sort of juggle those very positive visions versus how do we set really reality and boundaries without dampening it? Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it is really a challenge. With it is it's a challenge, but I also think it's not a challenge if we can actually recognize that this is what's very likely to, you know, on the one hand, where we say we want to talk about these really imaginative futures, to build in checks and balances into the project, into the process, where you can keep coming back to that and keep asking yourselves questions about, okay, well, how realistic is this? Is this something, have we considered, you know, some of the limitations to what we're talking about here, and do we want to adjust it? So this isn't, and I guess this is again why I said it's important to spread the work out over time. And it does take quite a lot of resources and energy because you are constantly cycling back to those ideas that you've had and the assumptions that you've made. And it's also a collaborative process. So, you know, this kind of question of, well, will that ever happen or not? It will get raised inevitably by lots of the different participants in the room. I think another quick point I would make on that, and I guess if I reflect on the Fair Food Futures project and the outcomes that we've got, yes, we have four futures. These are not the only types of fair food justice futures that people might imagine, depending on who would be in the room. Like I said, I think one big gap is really a future that really centres more around rural or regional food systems, which might look quite different to some of the things that people who are mostly our participants, very urban located, had to say. So that's one space you would come back to that and you can expand it. But for me, there's also big opportunities then in diving deeply into the narrative itself and asking questions about, well, within this storyline, what are the elements that are, you know, what are the elements that we could work with to actually maybe get us to some of this change? So I think for me, I'm really interested in looking at the understanding of rights within this and who is putting forth that idea and how it might look. Some of the ideas, for example, around the commons is also really interesting in this work, and who is going to be doing that recommoning of food and of land. Indigenous sovereignty also comes up across in lots of the scenarios, but really you could really much more deeply dive into what that is within each of those scenarios or outside of those scenarios. You know, it might even be that in presenting your scenarios, they're rejected by some groups because actually they're not aligned with the kinds of things that they see as being most important. Any other questions?
Yeah, and if you're online, please feel free to, I know that we're all absorbing the info, so there's not a lot of questions now in the chat. People have been commenting as we go. But if you're online and you have a question, please do unmute and speak to us. Andy, I see, has his hand up. Hello, Andy.
Hi there. Just a quick question. Earlier on, you talked about the qualitative analysis. When you're dealing with groups and around ideas and concepts, how important is the quantitative?
The quantitative, yeah. Look, in my work, I don't use very much quantitative approach, but having said that, when you're thinking about the drivers, in particular that scoping out, you might draw on quantitative data to help understand those trends, you know, again, an example of climate change is a really good example where quantitative data around changing trends help to inform the drivers of change that you might want to see. Same with, transport. You might want to look at data on transport use, or, on social inequality or poverty. You might want to look at data on poverty, data on hunger, whatever it might be. So you can use that to inform. But I guess also earlier on, I spoke about those 3 different types of scenarios. And really in that first more predictive type of scenario, these are really much more quantitative, where they look at modeling and extrapolating out from quantitative data. But in a narrative scenario like the ones I've talked about, I would say it's probably less, you would be less likely to use quantitative data to construct your scenario in that middle stage. You'd use it more for informing where you started from.
Yeah, thank you. And
Great.
Thanks for the presentation.
Great, thanks everyone. Yes, I've got another question from the room. Yeah. Yeah, just ask and I'll translate it here.
Thank you, that was great. I'm really inspired. And thinking of all of the different ways I can use this approach to my own research and my teaching. But when you came to the point at which you had a little intersecting with the different projects, you had pulled, I think, 2 of those kind of key points from the earlier graph, and then them together. Can you just talk us through the decision-making process about choosing which one's going to be?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was about how did we decide which 2 drivers to put on the 2 axes? Because we had lots of different drivers and they were ranked all differently, and then we only had to choose 2. So obviously in this study, as I said, we did it lots of times. So we could come up with lots of different components. Now, it's actually a really good question, because when we did the first workshop, we didn't realize how difficult that would be. We actually did it much more fluidly. We had everyone in the room just come and pick 2 drivers that they liked and put them together. That didn't work very well, because we found that sometimes 2 of those, depending on what they were, sometimes they were just really hard to imagine how they were even connected to each other. Okay, so that was a bit of a limitation on just randomly choosing 2 to put together. So what we did then in the next down the track is we actually thought really hard about those drivers, and we selected which ones were going to go together in a way that would we could see how they were making a connection. Okay, so we had, and some of them are quite obvious and you can think through, like localizing food supply chains and disasters. Okay, so when we put those 2 axes together, like the length of a food supply chain and the disasters more or less or fewer or intense or less, this is when we ended up with people really talking about resilience, and they were using the language of resilience and disaster. It was, and obviously we were in the middle of COVID when we did this as well. So some of the axes fit really well together and some fit less well together. Some of them were also very difficult to imagine, even when we tried to put them together. And that had to do with who was in the room, the stakeholders that were in the room. And I'll be really open to say that one of the most challenging was when we had the access around Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge. And where in that workshop, we actually didn't have very many Indigenous people. We only had a couple. So it was really difficult and challenging for people in the room to feel comfortable or confident or in, the situatedness of people to actually talk around that issue was a limitation for thinking about that access. Yeah. But, I think that you can combine the axes really in any way you like, and it just becomes a creative process. Mm. And I should also say, no matter what axes we put together in our study, sometimes across all of the scenarios, some of the same things were being put up in the scenario, regardless of what the axis was. And these things, if I can actually show you, if I share my screen here, let me just go to this slide really quickly. If I go to this one, oops. We found that there were threads that ran through every single scenario. Oh, sorry, where is it? All the way back here, I think. Yeah, there were threads that ran through every single scenario, regardless of the axes. And they were things like right to food. There were things like localizing food systems. The concept of resilience and crisis and climate was coming up everywhere. this idea, we've called it, and they've become a little bit more theoretical because I'm drawing on theory around food justice, but this idea of commoning land and kind of redistributing and democratizing land, food, participation. So there were some threads that ran through all of the scenarios. And so for us, this is how I chose to try to show that, to have, you know, we've got 4 scenarios, they focus on different things. And this is because we had quite focused workshops. So we had one very specific workshop, which was on youth and climate action. And it was one of the ones we did quite towards the end, because youth and climate action was coming up time and time again as a group that needed to be more included, that had strong voice, and that really played a strong role in climate action. So we said, all right, well, let's build on that. And it ended up being, you know, shaping one of those end scenarios. And the same with technology. Technology and the role that technology would play in the future food system came up time and time again as quite important. So we decided, let's have a workshop just on technology future. And then that became, we decided in the end, okay, let's actually, one of our future scenarios is going to be around that, because it's really important across lots of them.
Excellent. Kiah, I'm aware that we're starting to run out of time, so I might just allow this one last question, which Sarah has asked, which I think is a lovely one. She said, what's your actual education background that led you to this point? What lens do you approach this work in scenario planning? But my additional question would be, how do other people get to know more about scenario planning? Thanks, Kiah.
Thanks. So my educational background, I have a background in sociology and in development studies and in environment studies. And my work for quite some time has focused on food. So I did a lot of agri-food political economy. So understanding, you know, power in food systems, that's kind of my big thing. And as a sociologist, we love to talk about power and structure and agency. So that's why I ask these kinds of questions. Also, though, this work is really connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I've done some work in that setting at the UN level, thinking about food system governance, thinking about kind of that high level planning around development, international development. So for me, I brought these two together. I was actually working on with some work around the Sustainable Development Goals as they were being created. Before before they were released, we did some background work, and they were around the COP17, the Durban COP, the Rio +20 that was in Brazil in 2012. So at that time, I was working in the space where Sustainable Development Goals were being imagined. And I think for me, that really made me say and understand that the SDGs are a particular vision for the future that come from a whole lot of stakeholders, particular stakeholders, deciding what the SDGs are going to look like. And when I bring that with my agri-food political economy background, you can start to see that it's actually around power and whose ideas count. So yeah, this Fair Food Futures project, this is funded by the Australian Research Council. It's a 4-year project. So I've had lots of time and space to be able to experiment, particularly with the food utopias approach, which has gone for me really beautifully in with future scenarios as a method. I would also quickly add that the Australian Council for International Development does future scenario planning workshops, and I actually attended one of those last year to help kind of learn how to do this in a development setting. I'll write that down here. They're called ACFED for short, but you can look them up, and I'm not sure how often they do them, but it was a really great approach or way to learn a bit more about it.
Can you say that name again, Kiah? Australian Council for?
Australian Council for International Development. I can write it here.
Australian Council for International Development. Oh, never heard of them. Look, there was one more question, but I'm really sorry, guys and girls, we're out of time. But I would like to say a huge thank you to Kiah and encourage you all to stay connected, whether it's through Kiah's work or through Regen Brisbane or through Greenprints. You're going to see a lot more of this real work being done, bringing folks together, challenging the power structures, doing groovy things. And Greenprints is passionate about helping people really develop scenarios built on the biophysical glory of bioregions, catchments, and then weaving all the other human stuff in, whether it's food, transforming the economy, connecting to NINA and the New Economy Network, connecting to future dreaming and Regen songlines for all the Indigenous input and leadership. So there's so much lovely stuff going on in this space. Kiah, is there anything else you'd like to say to wrap up? Otherwise, a huge thank you to you. Really, it's been a wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And also thanks for letting me open it up here to our people here at UQ in the room. It's been fun. The wall, I've got all my stuff stuck up on the wall over there, which is really nice to see it out of the cupboard again. But thank you. I'd love you to go if you're interested in this fair food work. And it is really grounded in place in Brisbane and Southeast Queensland, but also more nationally. Go along to the Fair Food Futures website and have a look.
Thank you, Kiah. And
Okay,
Kiah, we'd love to weave you into the Regen Brisbane processes, particularly next year, where we are going to begin the long-term scenario planning around Brisbane's future, including weaving in the Olympics. Yeah, all on a Greenprints scaffolding. So thank you again. And thanks to everyone in the room.
Yeah.
And Kiah, if you take a few photos of your stuff up on the walls, we'd love to have that as a souvenir of your workshop today. So
Fantastic. I will. All right. Thanks very much, everyone.
thanks, everyone. See you
Bye.
soon.